On the 19th of August 1980, one of the deadliest disasters in aviation history unfolded on the runway at Riyadh International Airport in Saudi Arabia's capital. 301 people lost their lives as a Lockheed L-1011 Tristar made an emergency landing due to an in-flight fire. The horrifying disaster boggles the mind. Somehow no one on board the jumbo jet survived a flight that never even crashed. Although much of the details about the accident remain unknown, this video will attempt to parse through the information that is available in the official accident report and other sources to tell the story of the ill-fated flight as accurately as possible. Saudia Flight 163 was a regular scheduled flight from Karachi, Pakistan to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia with a stopover in Riyadh, operated by Saudi Arabia's national airline using a wide-body Lockheed L-1011 Tristar. The first leg from Karachi to Riyadh was normal, and after the intermediate stop at Riyadh International Airport, 287 passengers and 14 crew boarded the aircraft for the journey westward to Jeddah. Some of the crew and about half of the passengers were Saudi nationals, while 85 passengers were from Pakistan and 32 from Iran. Most of these passengers were heading to Jeddah to participate in the Hajj. Because Jeddah is the main international gateway for travelers to Mecca, this route is heavily traveled during this time. In command of the flight were Captain Mohammed Koiter, age 38, First Officer Sami Hassanain, age 26, and Flight Engineer Bradley Curtis, age 42. Captain Koiter had been a pilot for Saudia since 1965, but had only recently switched to flying this type of aircraft and had just 388 hours on this aircraft type. Notes in Koiter's file shows he experienced difficulties during training of the L-1011 aircraft, and instructors had at various points commented that Koiter was mentally behind his aircraft, was slow to learn, needed more training than normally required, failed recurrent training, and had problems upgrading to another aircraft. First Officer Hassanan had been flying for less than 2 years and had only 125 hours on the L-1011. In 1975, he was dropped from Saudia's pilot training program due to poor progress. But in 1977, he was one of several previously dropped trainees who was reinstated by committee action, and he was finally hired in 1978. Flight Engineer Bradley Curtis, a U.S. citizen, had worked for Saudia since 1974, but had only been certified on the L-1011 for 3 months, and had only 157 hours on this type of aircraft. In 1975, he failed out of captain training on the Boeing 737, but just 2 years later he managed to become a first officer on the 737, but was fired after failing a check ride in 1978. Apparently desperate to be a pilot, he then offered to pay for his own training to become a flight engineer if Saudia promised to hire him afterwards. This offer was accepted and he was back with Saudia as a flight engineer in 1979. The total L-1011 line experience of the 3 members of the flight crew was only 670 hours, and all 3 individuals were below average pilots according to their training records. But ignoring all of that, at 9:08 p.m., Saudia Flight 163 took off from Riyadh and began climbing towards its cruising altitude. Captain Koiter began whistling and singing, a habit he had formed throughout the years and would resurface throughout this flight. It wasn't too long before things started to go wrong. 7 minutes after takeoff, one of the 2 fire alarms in the rear C3 cargo compartment went off, alerting Flight Engineer Curtis to the presence of a fire. From this point on, all the quotes taken were directly from the CBR transcript, which is included almost in its entirety. Alerting the captain of the problem, Curtis said, "Be aft cargo." First Officer Hassanan broke his silence to ask, "What's going on?" It is apparent at this point that Curtis's lack of specificity was confusing the other pilots. "Smoke detection, be aft cargo," Curtis said, finally explaining what was wrong with the aft cargo compartment. "Stop ventilation," Koiter ordered. As it turned out, this might have had deadly consequences later. "Now it is in A, both of the aft cargo compartments," Curtis said. "So we have to be returning back to the airport, right?" Koiter asked, as though it wasn't his decision. "Both A and B aft cargo smoke detection," Curtis repeated. "So we have smoke there," said Koiter. Curtis agreed. "I would say so, yeah," he said. Incredibly, the pilots spent all this time deciding whether the activation of a smoke alarm indicated the presence of smoke. A little over 1 minute had now passed since the smoke alarm first activated. It was rapidly becoming clear this was a serious situation which warranted their undivided attention. "What's the procedure for in the checklist?" Koiter asked. "Yeah, I am looking for that now," said Curtis. Flying through the pilot's handbook, looking for the appropriate checklist for the situation, we now hear that Koiter went back to singing and humming in this seemingly desperate situation. For some time, Curtis tested to make sure the alarm wasn't false while narrating everything he was doing. After the test showed the alarms were working properly, Koiter said, "We have cleared the situation." It's not clear why he said this or what he meant. Perhaps he was misinterpreting the purpose of Curtis's test. Following up on Curtis's earlier attempt to find the appropriate checklist for smoke in the cargo hold, Corder said, "There isn't anything about it in the abnormal procedures?" "Nothing," said Curtis. "Should I just go back there and see if I can find anything or smell anything?" Curtis opened the cockpit door and added, "If I can see or smell something, I think we better go back." After another short exchange, Curtis left the cockpit to check the cabin for signs of smoke. In the back of the passenger cabin, smoke was already seeping through the cargo hold, catching the attention of passengers seated in the last rows on the left side. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain and first officer continued discussing the situation. Breaking his silence, Hassanan said, "Strange no procedure for it." "We are 60 miles out," said Corder, "and we better turn back to Riyadh." Only now, 4 minutes after the smoke detection, did the pilots decide to return to the airport. This was not considered excessive at the time, although it would be today. Some 15 seconds later, Curtis returned to the cockpit, saying, "We've got a fire back there," slamming the door behind him. "We do?" Corder asked. "Yes, we do," said Curtis. "It's okay. Call please," Corder said to Hassanan. "Tell him we're coming back." Hassanan then keyed the radio and said, 163, "We're coming back to Riyadh." "I would declare an emergency," Curtis suggested. "Yeah," said Corder. At that exact moment, a flight attendant burst into the cockpit. "Fire! Fire in the cabin," she said. Hassanan keyed his mic again and told the controller, "Saudia 163, we've got a fire in the cabin and please alert the fire trucks." However, he did not declare an emergency. At Riyadh International Airport, fire trucks scrambled to intercept the incoming L-1011. By this point, judging by the flight attendant's comments, the raging fire in the cargo hold had apparently burned through the cabin floor near the last row of seats on the left. Passengers in the rear smoking section would have started to panic and try to move forward. Back in the cockpit, while Hassanan handled more procedural radio communications, in the background it is heard that Corder told Curtis to take a look in the cabin again. Moments later, Curtis returned to the cockpit and started to say, "It's just a fire in the," Curtis said, stumbling over his words. "What?" Corder clarified. "It's just smoke in the aft," he said. This was inconsistent with the flight attendant's observations of the fire, so perhaps the actual flames were obscured by smoke when he went back to look. Regardless of the reason, this probably gave Captain Corder the impression the situation was less dire than it actually was. While Hassanan called out navigational information, Curtis kept muttering to himself, "No problem, no problem, no problem at all." Meanwhile, Corder and Hassanan prepared for the landing. "Did we declare an emergency?" Curtis asked. "Negative," said Corder. Although they absolutely should have declared an emergency, at least everything they would need for an emergency landing was in order. The pilots continued through their pre-landing checklist. "No smoking sign on," said Hassanan. "Okay, no smoking sign," said Corder. They were evidently using a normal approach checklist as though this wasn't an emergency landing. They rattled off more minor settings. Anti-ice, off. HSI heading set, set. Seatbelt sign, on. Logo light, checked. Even in the middle of a dangerous emergency, they bothered to turn on the logo light on the tail. They rattled off more items, most of them somewhat important. Then, another smoke alarm went off. A flight attendant entered the cockpit once again. "We tried to put out the fire, but it's just too big." Back in the cabin, flight attendants had grabbed 6 fire extinguishers from the front of the airplane and were discharging them one by one into the fire. "There's fire?" Curtis asked, apparently oblivious to the pandemonium in the rear of the plane. Turning to the pilots, Curtis said, "There's a fire back there," as though this wasn't already obvious. "Okay," said Corder, turning to Hassanan. "Tell them we have an actual fire in the cabin." As the plane approached the airport, Curtis scanned the instruments. Piece of cake," he said, probably trying to calm himself down. Captain Corder and First Officer Hassanan proceeded through the normal landing checklist, checking many of the same items as they reviewed in the approach checklist. The flight attendant, still in the cockpit, now asked Corder the same question she asked Curtis moments earlier. "Do you want us to evacuate passengers, Captain?" "What?" Corder said. "Do you want us to evacuate the passengers as soon as we stop?" she said. "Take your position," he told her, without answering her single question. One of the most important steps in any emergency landing with a fire on board is to make sure that the flight attendants are ready for an immediate evacuation. But Corder seemed entirely nonchalant. Was he really so oblivious to the danger his aircraft was in? We may never know. Captain Corder was then heard calling out, "Gear down," preparing for landing. On the ground, witnesses saw the plane coming in to land with smoke streaming out of its tail. The pilots called out more flap settings. Someone announced 500 feet. Corder started singing again. Curtis was heard muttering to himself, "Looking good." Then, in perhaps the most fateful comment of the flight, Corder said, "Tell them not to evacuate." 25 seconds later, the cockpit voice recorder cut out almost at the moment of touchdown. What exactly happened in the cockpit after this will never be known. 21 minutes after the first fire alarm was set off, Saudia Flight 163 touched down smoothly on the runway in Riyadh. The rollout was normal, except for the fact that Captain Coiter braked only gently, even though full braking power was available. The L-1011 rolled down the runway for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, while fire engines chased along behind. Finally, almost at the end of the runway, the plane pulled off to the left into the taxiway and came to a stop. Fire trucks approached the aircraft, but found that the engines were still running, making it too dangerous to get close. Fire crews observed flames in the rearmost 4 windows of the left side, and when the fire suddenly burst through the top of the fuselage, they started spraying the plane with as much foam as they could muster. Meanwhile, the controller relayed to the crew firefighters' concern about the engines. The pilots acknowledged, and shortly after, the engines were finally shut down. Inside the cabins, passengers flooded towards the forward exits while smoke rolled down the aisles, but the flight attendants never attempted to open the doors. Either they had been told not to, or they couldn't reach them. In the tower, controllers heard the very last transmission from the aircraft, hearing Captain Coiter say, "Affirmative, we are trying to evacuate now." After that, all calls were met with silence. At that moment, toxic smoke containing carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, and other deadly chemicals swept through the plane. Its spread was exacerbated by the pilot's inexplicable decision to close all the vents, which prevented the fumes from escaping the aircraft. The smoke quickly overcame the passengers and crew as they were queued for the still unopened exits, killing all 301 people on board. The firefighters at Riyadh International Airport had never fought an aircraft fire before. They also knew next to nothing about the Lockheed L-1011 or how to operate its many exterior doors. Firefighters finally managed to open a door more than 23 minutes after the engines were shut down. Observing dense smoke inside the plane, firefighters called out to anyone who might still be alive, but there was no response. Moments later, a flashover caused accumulated gases to combust, and fire rolled down the length of the plane, forcing the firefighters to retreat. The plane burned for some time, destroying everything above the window line. The next morning, the hollow husk of the L-1011 stood there on the taxiway, a grisly monument to the hundreds who perished in what was one of the deadliest aviation accidents in history. The subsequent investigation was unable to answer some of the most vexing questions about the accident. What exactly started the fire was never determined because the evidence had burned away. The most likely explanation was that something in the passenger's baggage caught fire, perhaps a box of matches or a bottle of kerosene for cooking on the trek to Mecca. Although the fire on board Flight 163 was a very serious emergency, it was clear that the high fatality count was a result of errors made by the crew. Investigators calculated that if the pilots had brought the plane to a stop as quickly as possible and ordered an immediate evacuation, most likely everyone would have survived. In the end, no single explanation adequately accounts for all of the unanswered questions that still surround the tragedy of Flight 163. The Commission recommended that the crews be trained to take immediate action if smoke is seen, instead of waiting to determine the severity of the fire. That Saudia trains its first officers to be more assertive, make sure its inexperienced pilots are not placed together, stop reinstating trainees who have failed data training programs, and hire personnel to more thoroughly check baggage for disallowed items. They also had the Riyadh International Airport overhaul its training for firefighters to ensure that they adequately prepare to save lives in an emergency situation. One final takeaway from the tragedy is that despite the apparent incompetence of the flight crew, the flight attendants acted heroically until the very end. The 11 cabin crew, most of whom were Filipino, bravely fought the fire until they ran out of extinguishers. At least 5 empty CO2 extinguishers and at least 1 water extinguisher were found in the wreckage of the cabin, fully empty. The scenes inside the cabin can only be imagined as the flight attendants pushed through the panicking passengers, running toward danger instead of away from it, emptying one extinguisher after another into the face of the inferno that ultimately took their lives. Rest in peace to the hundreds of lives lost that day. That is the story of Saudia Flight 163. If you are interested in more stories like this one, check out this video that you might enjoy.